Hey guys, Dark Humility here with an important update for mapping in Season 9. This is an update to my Season 6 video that I made shortly after map Fortification was introduced. And today, of course, we'll be talking about the density changes in Season 9, because a lot of people in Project Diablo 2 seem to be confused by that, which honestly makes perfect sense because the numbers are completely different. And so no one really knows what's good anymore for like a new map density, or even what it means for true map density or the actual density of the monsters you're killing in the maps. But we're also going to just update that video in general and also go over a whole bunch of other topics as well related to mapping. Because it seems like I get more questions about mapping than absolutely anything. Of course, we'll have timestamps for every section of this video, and we will go over exactly how mapping is working in Season 9, and hopefully all of you guys at the end of this video will become mapping experts and will feel confident when rolling, mapping, doing anything regarding maps. Mapping is almost its own mini game in Project Diablo 2 as it is, especially as of Season 9. In the early days, things were a lot simpler, and there really wasn't quite as much to even look into. You know, you might have had different tiers of maps, and you had blue and rare maps, but there's only 3 of them, and you couldn't do like all these other crazy things to them. So this is for both new and expert players alike. So, we're gonna start with the thing that I think most people will probably be coming to this video for is what is different in Season 9 about maps. So anyone that doesn't still know what maps are, I'd move on to the next section of this video. But for anyone who already knows what maps are but is very confused about the changes to the maps in Season 9, we will, of course, go over that here. Alright, so let's start with the first section of the video. We will talk about these density changes. Now, you might notice that across the board, the maps appear to have much lower density numbers. See where it says monster density? Yeah, so what's going on there is that number is 50% lower on average across the board than it was in the previous season. So that will result, of course, in a 50% reduction in actual map density as well. However, to counter this, they've actually increased the base monster density, which is kind of a hidden stat that varies based on whether or not a map is white, blue, or rare just to begin with, just the quality of the map to begin with. And that stat has been increased by 60%, so the base map density is increased by 60%, whereas the monster density modifier, which can be re-rolled and which can change, has been decreased by 50%. Overall, this results in a 10% net gain in map density, period. So overall, the map density isn't lower from the previous seasons, it's actually higher. However, that's because that base density is a hidden stat. So, indeed, that is something that you cannot see, but this number is lower. The philosophy, I think, behind this, if I'm speaking correctly, and in turn, is that the idea is now that you get higher density without necessarily needing to roll for density quite as much on the map. So the actual map density, even if it's a little bit lower, you'll still be getting more density out of it. So it doesn't feel like running a map with lower density is as bad as it was in previous seasons. So that's the main thing that's going on there. That is why, that is what's going on. That is what's happening. Now, what does that mean practically speaking, though? So if they've reduced the density by 50%, what are the quote-unquote good density numbers now that they've done that? So, based on my own rerolling and rolling experience, I would say what that pretty much means is that now instead of looking for maybe on a tier 1 map, let's say you're looking at one of these, instead of looking for around 120 to like 150 density on a rolled rare map as your modifier, the monster density percent is now most optimal around 60 to 80 or 60 to 90. 60 to 90 plus is what I would say. So even 60 is okay to roll for a tier 1, but obviously this is a very important stat, so the higher you get it, the better. But anything as low as 60 instead of 120, which it probably would have been good at before, is still pretty solid for a tier 1 map roll. So 60 plus on your tier 1 maps is definitely a good range. Or 60 to 90 and then beyond if you can get that on an initially rolled map. Obviously, if you corrupt it with a Worldstone shard thereafter, you will further increase the map, and the map will be even better. So that's really good. On a tier 2, you're definitely going to want to pump that number up. So on a tier 2, I would say at least 80 plus monster density. 80 to 100 plus, I would say, is pretty good for what you're looking for on a tier 2. I mean, something as low as 70 can also kind of be fine as well, but in general, you're looking for that. Maybe the minimum could be 70, so maybe 70 plus instead of 60 plus there on a well-rolled tier 2. On a tier 3 now in Season 9 and probably beyond, because I don't see them changing this again anytime soon, but they might, you're definitely looking for in a tier 3 maybe 90 plus. So of course, unless you have monster rarity, which is a stat that we'll talk about when we talk about the importance of various stats that you're rolling, period. But in general, you'll notice like this tier 3, for instance, has 119. I'd go even beyond like 90 plus though. If you can roll 100 plus, that's really good on your initial density. Anywhere 100 plus is really solid. 90 plus is kind of okay on your tier 3s, because 90 plus would be equivalent to where 180 plus was before, just to give you an idea, because of the 50% total reduction. And of course, if you can get higher than that, this is like the equivalent of almost a 240 map before. And of course, with the base density increases, that means you're getting even more density than a previously rolled like 240 map. So that's exactly what that means in real terms. And so if you kind of just reduce where your brain was by 50% across the board, you'll get to some pretty good results. Once again, tier 1s, I would say anything 60 and higher is pretty solid. Tier 2s maybe 70 to 80 and higher. And tier 3s 90 to 100 and higher. And if you can roll those, you're going to get some very solid maps overall. Alright, so that's all they've really changed in Season 9. So if you're confused about the new monster density percent modifiers on the maps, that's what's going on. Overall, it is a density increase. So just trying to get that out there from the patch notes, because I know not everyone wants to spend the time to read the patch notes and whatnot. And the patch notes are often like 50 billion pages. You know, my feedback notes are often, you know, a billion pages as well. So, because I always give feedback to everything. And, you know, there's always things you can improve. But yeah, that's kind of how it is. So if you don't really understand what the change is, that's basically what it is. Lower numbers are now even better than numbers over double than what they were before. So that's where you should be centering your understanding of the new maps in Season 9. Alright. Now let's actually go back to the basics. So that's for the people that kind of already understand everything about maps and, you know, they're comfortable with maps and really don't understand what's going on in Season 9 and are thus confused as to maybe what even a good map is in Season 9. Alright, so let's go over the basics. Why maps? What is a map? What do you get out of maps? Why do maps in Project Diablo 2? And what are they? So a map is an area that is an area level anywhere from 87 to 89, which is, of course, for anywhere from tier 1 to tier 3. And then when it comes to dungeons, it could be an area level of 92, I believe is still what it is. And that would be a tier 4 map. Maps are these higher area levels, which means all the monsters are these levels as well. LOD areas in Project Diablo 2, even in a corrupted zone, which is an area that rotates every 15 minutes, can only be up to monster level 85. So 85 level monsters can drop most items in the game, and the elites and champions in those 85 areas can drop every item in the game. But in an 87 plus area, every monster, even regular monsters, can drop every item in a game. Of course, on top of that, if we're talking about rare maps, and even blue maps to some extent, their density can exceed very quickly the monster density, and the density of elite packs can very quickly exceed that of regular LOD areas. Obviously, LOD areas are strong for other reasons, not just monster density, such as killing bosses. You can repeat these areas a lot faster, which means you can finish off the bosses faster. You can repeatedly kill really juicy monsters like ghosts and council members. And of course, making the areas repeatable in general can be very good, because in maps, sometimes you'll run out of elite packs towards the end. However, maps, when you're strong enough to kill and to plow through the maps quickly, do outstrip the efficiency of farming LOD areas for the most part, unless you're target farming certain kinds of items. So, maps are also in general a test of a character's power, especially doing the toughest maps like the tier 3 maps, the unique maps, which are usually tier 3, or they're just upper tier in general. And then of course group mapping and dungeons will also test the power of your character as well. And the better rolled the map is overall, so rolling a map, we're talking about that at the moment, which we'll go over, but the more efficient it becomes relative to LOD farming. And the stronger your character is, the more efficiently it will do maps relative to LOD content in general. Maps are also very key to a mod that wants to like equalize power between the sorceress class and other classes, especially equalize between classes with and without teleport, or without access to teleport, and builds that don't want to use teleport, because the density is so high that you don't need to teleport from monster pack to monster pack, which is a lot more of a thing in LOD content, where the sorceress and other teleporting classes tend to dominate, such as druid and necromancer and things of that nature. They're just more accessible to every class and build, period, and it's more of a game of how fast you can deal damage, how much damage can you do in a limited area for some builds, and just how powerful the build is in general. And when it comes to getting loot and experience, maps are king once your build reaches certain thresholds. Now, those thresholds do kind of depend on some things. However, typically, builds, if we're using a plus skill system, you know, how many skills the build has, how many skillers, whatever. Not every build, of course, relies on plus skills for damage, but generally speaking, a build that will achieve 35 to 40 skills is becoming more efficient in maps than LOD areas at that point. It's starting to become it, kind of depends on the build. And then once it starts to exceed 40 skills, it is very clear that maps are a clear winner efficiency-wise, even over the best areas in LOD content like Chaos, Travancore, Mephisto, Arcane Sanctuary, and of course, Cows and all the other ones that you may be aware of. Alright, such as, you know, all the other 85 areas, corrupted zones, whatever. But yeah, that's definitely the case. So that's why maps are good. Of course, maps also are the only place you can find certain items. It is also the most common way to find other maps. There are certain items as well that are locked behind maps, such as sigils for Uber Ancients, which give you a pinata of loot, so that's really cool. You need to do tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 maps to get these sigils, and if you get one of each, you can do a round of Uber Ancients, which is really cool. Of course, also, you will get items like pure demonic essences from bosses, and you can get Harajam scarabs for doing dungeons. Also, maps have events, which also tend to give you various pinatas of loot as well, such as for map materials, which would be the treasure goblin. Of course, you can also get other materials as well, such as Splinter of the Void from the Mendeln event, so that's another map exclusive item. There's a bunch of other items as well that you can only find within maps, of course. Not too many. That's most of them, pretty much what I went over there. There might be a couple others as well I forgot to mention. But yeah. And of course, there's just, you know, you've got the Darkness event as well, dropping tons of World Stone shards. You can even get keys in maps from the Shadow event, which is really cool as well. And you click that pillar and you get keys off of those shadows. So, keys for Ubers. So there's just all kinds of really big advantages when it comes to generating currency in maps. And once your build is flying through maps, even tier 1s, that's pretty much where you want to stay if your build is a mapping build for generating currency and otherwise. Alright, so these maps are higher density areas in general, and they're just bigger areas in general. Even a white map will have elites spread throughout it, right? It won't have as high of density, but it'll be a bigger area than an area such as the pit, for instance. And a blue map will increase the density from there pretty much by 50%, or yeah, 50%, and then another 50% increase from blue to rare on the density as well. And that's just the base density of the map, so that's pretty insane. And obviously, my opinion, where maps really truly become viable and become consistently viable over all LOD content is once you get to the rare maps. It used to be that you could farm like lower maps for bosses or for map events, but they kind of nerfed those things because it was pretty overpowered to just like do boss runs and things of that nature within the maps. Do event runs, constantly spawning events in the maps and then taking advantage of it and getting a bazillion keys. In previous seasons, that was definitely a thing, even as recent, I think, as Season 7 and 6, when I first made a mapping video. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's why maps. A map is just an extra area you can create anywhere in Act 5. These are maps. This is what they look like. You can find them throughout the game, but they're a lot more common in maps themselves. And the higher the tier of map, the more likely you are to find other higher tier maps versus lower tier ones. But you can find the highest tier maps even in tier 1 maps. In LOD areas, you can find only tier 1 maps, which are certain kind of maps that are like Royal Crypts, at least in Season 9. That changes depending on the season, though. They often do rotations, which changes the tiers of maps and the immunities of the monsters in the maps, but in general, the maps have the same monster types. In general, I mean, they do a couple switch outs on those as well every once in a while. But yeah, you can see Area Battlefield is also a tier 1. We got Sewers, which is a tier 1 this season. Those can all be found in the Lord of Destruction standard game areas. Starting, I think, late Nightmare, and then Act 5 Nightmare, and then, of course, into Hell mode everywhere. So, good stuff. Alright, finding maps. Okay, so one thing that is, of course, very important to mention is that if you haven't found a map by the time you think your character might be powerful enough to do them, or you just want to test your character in a map, but you haven't actually found one in the beginning of a season, you can always get one from Anya. Now, you have to save Anya to get it, but once you save Anya in Hell, she will give you a free map. So you automatically have access, no matter what, to a free tier 1 map. Now, it's a random map. It might not be the one you want, but you could always trade it or otherwise, and you, no matter what, get access to a map. So there's no reason not to say I have 0 maps and I can't do it. You just have to do Hell Anya. You talk to Anya. She gives you a map. It's that simple. So you gotta do the Anya quest, the Frozen River, blah, 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 and then you get a free map. Now, maps can also drop anywhere else, once again, in Nightmare Act 5 for sure. I think it might even be able to drop before that now. I don't actually 100% remember, but because they've changed this quite a few times. We've gone over a lot of iterations of it. But, yeah, like for instance, like farming Worldstone Keep in Nightmare is a pretty good way to get those maps, and I know that as a fact. But in throughout the rest of the game, though, you can get maps in Hell mode no matter what. So, you can get maps anywhere. Now, I will tell you, I farmed a ton of tier 1 maps and LOD content before I ever even entered maps on this character. Why? Because she is a hardcore character. And the hardcore characters, well, mapping can be very dangerous. There's a lot of monsters, and those monsters all want to kill you. And so sometimes they get crazy auras and they're all attacking you at once, and obviously without meat shields. Meat shields are very important in maps, but as you know, they can be very dangerous. So on this character, for instance, my Inferno Sork, it took a while. We farmed like 50 maps in LOD content. Now, some people think that they're not common enough. Now, at one point, I would say that, yeah, it was pretty rare to find maps in LOD content, maybe a little too much. But then they buffed the odds, and now I would say they're probably in a good place. It's possible they might even buff the odds again if people continue to complain about them. But they're not too hard to find in general. Now, let me give you some tips, though. If you want easier ways or more likelihood of finding maps in LOD before you start the whole mapping and rolling maps and the whole mapping train, which tends to lead to more maps because the maps are pretty easy to find within the maps themselves. So within the maps themselves, I mean, you get an average of like 2 to 3 maps per map almost, or at least 1 to 2. Which will at least replace that map plus give you additional ones. So it's just a factory that continues to generate more maps. It's like a snowball effect. Once you start entering maps, you get more maps. That's how it is. And of course, these are all kinds of maps. There's different ways to roll the maps and to even change what maps you have. And yeah, which we'll go over, of course. But maps aren't too hard, but let me give you some tips though. So there's a couple monster types that are really good at dropping maps. These are all the same monster types. They're also good at dropping runes, charms, gems, jewelry, worldstone shards, some other PD2 special items as well. Whatever. The same types of monsters that are good at dropping those even in original versions of the game in LOD, and that's because their loot table restricts them and makes it to where armors or weapons are either less common or completely impossible in their loot table, such as a ghost monster, a will-o-wisp, some kind of stormcaster type monster, strangler, whatever. Those monsters all cannot drop armor or weapon type items, which means getting a map from those type of items is actually, from those type of monsters is way more common. Also, what likes to drop these types of items, including maps, are clickables. And if you have telekinesis especially, there's no excuse when you're passing by like a random chest or a corpse or a body or a skeleton or whatever it is a rock even. There's like rocks, you know. Click the rocks with a telekinesis or with your character. Just click on them as you pass them by, and the maps actually are fairly common from those. Super chests included. This is one reason why Arcane Sanctuary, of course, with its ghosts, its specters, monsters, in addition to the super chests and all the other clickables along each path, are very good at dropping maps. So Hell Arcane is like an amazing spot. But even cows have elevated rune drop rates to some extent, and will also give you maps fairly frequently as well, and are very dense. So another area would be Hell Cows. That is an area you might want to target farm for maps and LOD content. There's a bunch of other areas as well, but overall those are probably the main ones, and yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, there's a bunch of other areas as well, but yeah. So like cows, ghosts, specters, stormcasters, that's why chaos tends to be pretty good as well. Even just like clicking random bodies in lower crossed, or even like Durance or something, has a pretty high chance to give you maps. Council members are good at dropping them just because they drop so many items. And I think from council members, they can only roll magic or rare as well, because they only drop magic or rare items, but I don't know if that applies to them as well. I don't remember, but I think that might be the case. And so all these types of areas that have these types of monsters, clickables, and cows are very good for dropping them. If you're only running areas like Maggot Lair and the Pit, and maybe not clicking the chests or whatever, I could see maybe why you might have problems finding maps in the LOD content. But in general, more monster density is better. You got ghosts, you got cows, you got clickables. Those are the top methods for finding the maps. And I found, like I said, over 50 before even entering a map this season, so I can tell you, it's definitely possible. I did farm a lot of clickables, and I did farm some arcane as well, so I didn't even like over farm arcane, but yeah, there's other areas, obviously like chaos, that have these types of monsters as well. And I farmed a lot of cows, so that also helped quite a bit as well. So, just some tips for finding the maps. Alright, so now, white, blue, and rare maps. So, I mean, as you can see here, this is a blue map. It has blue lettering. This is a white map. It has white lettering, and this is a rare map. It has yellow lettering. You can find all different qualities of maps, and you can change the quality of the maps with various rerolling orbs. So, that's really cool. But you can find them as either a blue, white, or rare map on the ground itself. So when they drop, they can be any of these qualities. The number of circles on my loot filter will tell you what tier the map is as well. So when it drops, you'll see River of Blood, and it will show that, and it will notify that as well with the 2 circles. So you know it's a tier 2 map, and you'll know it's white because it will also come up as white. So it's a white map. White maps have the least amount of density. Arguably, white maps are pretty comparable to farming LOD content in a lot of areas, such as the Pit, in terms of how dense the monsters are. Of course, however, without the ability to constantly repeat the map for killing bosses or just juicy monsters in general. This is why, in general, I don't necessarily recommend rushing into farming maps, even white maps, but you definitely can. And as a solo venture, white maps can be decent to farm. It's not terrible, but the density, the base density of the maps is about that, and then once you go up another 50% density, when it comes to the density in general, once you go up another 50%, you get, of like true base density, you get blue maps, and another 50% you get rare maps. Blue maps are straight up superior in density to almost every LOD area at that point. White maps can be superior as well, it kind of depends. But at that point, they pretty much are. And they tend to be a lot easier. White maps don't have anything that boosts the monster's power, so that's kind of neat. Of course, they'll all be level 87, which boosts their health and damage slightly from 85 monsters. They'll be 87, or they'll be 90 if they are elites or minions, and they'll be 88, 89, I mean, if they're champions. And of course, if you do a tier Sorry, since this is a tier 2, of course, the base monsters would be 88, and then 90, and then 91 for elites and their minions. But if it was a tier 1, which is a tier 1 there, you get a you get level 87 monsters, and then of course it's 89 for champions and 90 for elites and their minions. So tier 1s are 87 areas, tier 2s are 88 areas, tier 3s are 89 areas. White maps, of course, don't have anything that boosts the power of the monsters, but it's basically an area that has density maybe similar or a bit higher than LOD content. Whereas blue monsters start getting various stats that will improve the map, but then they'll also be improving the monsters. You usually get 1 or 2 of these stats on each. I think on blue maps you can only get 1 stat that modifies the monster, so it makes the monster stronger or has a random guess monster or whatever, and then you can get an increase in either experience and monster density or magic and gold find and monster density from the white maps. So on top of being blue maps and just overall being stronger in general, they will also be giving increased stats as well. So the blue maps are a little tougher, but the really juicy maps are the rare maps. The rare maps can give boosts to all kinds of things, and not just like a couple boosts to rarity or density or whatever. You can get up to 3 boosts with experience, monster density, magic and gold find, blah blah blah. But then the monsters have all kinds of power-ups. And of course, the density of rare maps in general is just higher as well. It's the base density, and of course, all the numbers can be a lot higher. So, and that's important to note. And of course, as you go up the tiers as well, the maps can also achieve even higher numbers in general, and the monsters themselves are a higher level. So, going up the tiers will make the monsters harder, and then of course will make it to where you can roll better stats on the map as well, from white to blue to rare. In the end game, when you're mostly farming, we're mostly gonna focus on rare maps, because these are the maps that are going to give you the best bang for your buck. There's a lot of maps you would almost be wasting if you didn't make them a rare map. But if you're not strong enough to do these rare maps with all these different monster stats, you could definitely go down to blue maps, and you'll still be getting some decent maps out of them. But this is definitely where the juicing is a thing. Want to juice those monsters for loot, and they give you the best bang for your buck. And then obviously, as you go up the tiers, as your character gets stronger, you get way more experience, you get way more loot, and the magic, all the numbers get higher, including the monster, the bad numbers for the monsters, but also the density, the gold find, the magic find, the rarity, and the experience get higher as well, making them even better. So even among rare maps, depending if you are doing a tier 1 or a tier 3, they get better. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff there. Of course, different tiers are assigned to maps depending on the season. So this season, you know, depending on the map, it'll be tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. They're always fixed, so it just depends on the map. So this season, Ashen's Plains is always tier 3. Kejistan's is always tier 3. Sewers is always tier 1. Royal is always tier 1. Horizon's always tier 1. Bastion's always tier 2. So within, depending on, of course, your character, you might want to do different maps. But that is something, of course, we'll be talking about next. But the tiers themselves are fixed to whatever the map is, which has different monsters and different monster immunities, which is something that's very important for your character. Of course, every tier of map, though, can be white map, a blue map, or a rare map. And of course, depending on how strong your character is, you're going to want to do one of those. Of course, rare maps being the goal. What I normally would want to do is I normally start mapping once I can do a rare tier 1, and then I'll start doing tier 2s and tier 3s as I get more damage and able to kill the slightly stronger monsters and the slightly higher problematic map stats. So that's kind of what we're going to target there. Alright, so that's all very, very cool stuff. Alright, we didn't talk about tier 4 maps, but basically with tier 4 maps, from map bosses, you can actually find these Herodrum Scarabs, and if you combine it in the key with a random tier 3 map, you will make a whole different map, which is a dungeon. And those dungeons, of course, you can then, from those dungeons, of course, you can then, you can run them with a group. They're like pretty much group-only maps, but not exclusively. But in order to actually clear them, you need all kinds of different elements, and you need different ways to break the immunities in order to actually kill the monsters. The monsters have very, very high resistance, even beyond the floor of 100 resistance for an immunity. So you might need like conviction and lower resistance and all this other stuff just to break a fire immunity and to be able to clear the fire immune monsters. Or you need a character that just does all kinds of different damage, but it's still going to be very hard because those monsters are extremely tough. Once again, these are level 92 areas, and they tend to only have the strongest monster types, such as Death Lords, Souls, so like Burning Souls, Witches, Charter Zombies, all kinds of very, very dangerous monster types. You also get the Bloodbringers in there too, which have so much damage they can potentially one-shot you. So it's very dangerous stuff. You usually want to run them with a very well-coordinated group that can lower resistances quite a bit, or lower resistances to all kinds of damage, or weaken the monsters in various ways, like a Curse Necro, blah, blah, blah. But they're not solo running maps, so I wouldn't worry too much about tier 4s. And once again, you need a Herodrum Scarab to even make one, which come from map bosses, and you can't make a ton of those to begin with. So dungeons are very special, they're very different. You mostly run them as a group for experience. They're mostly really good for experience, and beyond that, you can get a ton of loot from the bosses that you kill there as well. And even regular monsters in a 92 area can drop rerollable Grand Charms, which is pretty nuts. But overall, I wouldn't worry too much about those, especially if you're just getting into mapping. So, very cool stuff, but yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Anyway, you can't even, I think with dungeons, you can't even reroll the maps anyway. So I think once you get them, you just have to, just do them as is. You can corrupt them to make them even better, but yeah. Another thing I should mention, of course, about map tiers in general is, besides in the beginning of the season, where groups will start out at tier 1 and then tier 2 and tier 3 maps, usually starting out with rare maps as quickly as they can. Most of the time, when you're running maps as a group, you're doing tier 3 or tier 4 maps because you're going for experience. And experience, the monster level, matters a lot. Obviously, like, the tier 3 maps also can have more density, which can get you more loot, and they can have higher rarity stats, which can also lead to more loot and better loot. But more so than anything, it's the experience, the EXP stat, that's going to be a key when it comes to getting that experience as a group. Usually you run maps as a group, not for loot, because you can get loot a lot more efficiently from solo farming, even if you split the loot among all 8 people and the monsters have a higher chance to drop the loot. It's not significantly higher to where you can actually split the loot and still get more loot. No, solo mapping is way better for loot. However, group mapping though, tier 3s, and then if you can get some tier 4s, some dungeons, that is where the really juicy experience comes, assuming of course your character is staying alive, not constantly dying, bit softcore and then losing your experience, or not dying at all if you're playing hardcore. So yeah, that's where the good stuff is. And of course, when you're running group maps, or if you want to run your own group maps, you really want those you want certain stats on those tier 3 maps or tier 4 maps, particularly monster rarity and density, and the experience stat to be as high as possible. Another thing to note about maps is you can apply an item called a standard of heroes to make the maps stronger. It will boost the experience and the density of maps, and you can acquire them from killing Uber Ancients, which once again requires acquiring sigils, trading for them, or finding them in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 maps. Once you kill Uber Ancients, though, they'll give you standard of heroes. You can cube those with a map too, not just a shard, a Worldstone shard to corrupt them, and that will boost their stats. Just a straight up boost. It doesn't do, like when you corrupt maps, you could have a trade-off where the monsters get stronger and then you get boost yourself, or you could just have player boost, but no, it's like straight up just a stat boost for the map, so you can make them even better. And obviously if you get catalyst shards from that one event in the maps, you can also apply those as well, and you can apply all these in whatever order you want to the map, and a map can have a standard of heroes, a Worldstone shard applied to it, and a catalyst shard applied to it all at once. And then you can get a random event, you could have boost stats, and then you could have a tit for tat modifier, or just some kind of player boost on the map as well from corrupting it. So you can also do those things to make the map stronger and modify them as well. Of course, I don't have any catalyst shards here to show you, but yeah. And then, of course, standard of heroes looks like the old ones do, but they actually do something, and you don't get them from Ubers as of Season 9 anymore, which is a great change, because people used to just kind of exploit them, and you could just get more just by having more players quickly enter a game and leave. But now there's actually a very reliable way to get those, and to farm for them, which is Uber Ancients, which I think is excellent. Alright, anyway. So we pretty much went over all those things pretty much all at once there, both 3 and 4. So we talked about white, blue, rare, and maps. We talked about map tiers. Alright, so the next things we're going to want to talk about is orbs. Alright, so there's different orbs here. You can purchase them all from Anya. They cost a ton of gold. The most efficient way, of course, to purchase these would be to get a 15% Geeds down here like I have in my stash, and then to use an Edge Bow rune word, which is this thing right here, and you put that on you, Edge Turtalium, and then Geeds Fortune. Reduce the vendor prices by 30%, go over here, and then yeah. Very good stuff. And then, of course, these costs will come down significantly. But they do cost a lot of gold. Which begs the question, when you're mapping, it's really important to either be using a Geeds or other gold find corruptions, so that while you're running around and picking up gold, whether it's invisible or not, to your loot filter, you'll pick it up, no matter what. And then you'll generate gold based on how much gold is dropping from the monsters. If you have an ice bow on a cold Amazon, a cold arrow Amazon, for instance, you're going to be generating a ton of gold. But the gold find stat matters. If you have none of that extra gold find stat, you're probably not going to be generating enough gold to sustain your ability to produce orbs. At like 150% with just the Geeds, I am barely, sustaining my ability to purchase the different orbs that I usually want to purchase, and even then, I might have to trade for some. So, having like a really low extra gold Geeds or no Geeds at all, you're probably not going to be able to sustain the ability to produce the orbs. If that's the case, you might want to consider making some kind of build like a gold find barbarian, and that just stacks a whole bunch of gold find and then kills Travancore for a bit and generates like 10 million gold very fast. Or you just want to make sure you have at least 150% is what I would say, or maybe anywhere from like 150 to 300% I would say is pretty comfortable for purchasing orbs from your actual gear, so keep that in mind. But at any rate, typically, unless you're like too weak to do rare maps, you're not going to be using the upgrade a white map to the magic map orbs, so typically you don't have to worry about this one, so we're not going to talk about this one too much. But this one's very important, the upgrade white to rare maps. Most of the maps you find are white, and even if they're not, usually you want to downgrade them to white so that they stack. Currently in Season 9, it could change in the future, but currently only white maps will stack. And this will essentially make it to where you want to actually make your maps white so that you're taking up the least amount of space in your inventory. So you either want to downgrade the maps to a white map, or when you find the white maps, you want to get them back to rare maps by using the recipes shown here. So obviously it will show you the recipe on my loot filter, but it will also now, there's descriptions as well for each of the orbs as well that they've built into it. Cube with a normal map, a jewel, and a rune to upgrade it to a rare map or a white map. When they say normal map, they mean white map. So you put all those in the cube. You could even put them stacked in the cube, however you want. 50 Zachram orbs, 50 jewel fragments. Jewel fragments are amazing. Finding those jewels and breaking them down in the cube with a key. Could be a skeleton key even. And then making jewel fragments, getting stacks of jewel fragments, stacks of white maps. And then a stack of any rune now. So any rune at all will work in Season 9 now. Not a Thule Plus rune as it was before, but any rune, which is really cool. Because now you can use whatever runes you want for crafting, and you're not like restricted to using all the better runes you might rather use for crafting. For mapping, you could use whatever runes you want for whatever purpose, which is really cool. So that's really neat. But yeah, anyway. So yeah, so you need stacks of those or just one of each, and then you'll make a rare map. So you're going to want a lot of these. This is like one of the most common things you're going to be purchasing. This is also one of the most common things you're going to want to be purchasing is the Haradrim orbs, because they re-roll the stats on the rare map. What this means is that you get totally different monster affix modifiers, and you also re-roll the density experience increases as well. And this will re-roll a rare map, which is really key. This is why most of the times you stick with rare maps as well, because they're all re-rollable, and you can constantly get the most optimal stats, which of course we'll talk about pretty soon here, what that means. What is an optimal stat, not an optimal stat? We'll save that for a bit later. But yeah, we have Orbs of Destruction. These are pretty cheap, and I always buy these in bulk. These things are important. It means if you don't want to get flooded with magic maps or just other maps that you don't need and maybe just want to trade because they're not optimal for your build, you're going to want to break them down and make them all normal maps so that they stack like your gems and your world stone shards and everything else in the mod that can stack. So that you don't have like full tabs of blue maps or rare maps that you don't need and that you could possibly trade for other maps or even for currency just lying around. So these are the 3 orbs that I consider to be the most important no matter your build, and you're going to want to buy these as soon as you get enough gold to afford them. They cost a ton of gold though, so typically you're going to need more than this amount of gold before you can afford full stacks. Depending on the stack, you might need somewhere between 2 million to 6 million gold if you have your, edge bow and your geeds 15%, if you can. Obviously, if you have a little bit of a lower geeds, it's not going to make a huge difference, but yeah, that's what's optimal. Of course, angelic orbs, they will also drop from the treasure goblins, and sometimes instead of breaking down those magic maps, you can just upgrade it to a rare map directly if you have some of these lying around, or it can be cheaper besides destroying it and then upgrading it later to just directly convert maybe maps that you want to use that you found as blue maps to magic map to rare maps directly. This will require perfect skulls though, as opposed to jewels, so do keep that in mind. And of course you will also need these orbs. So you could also purchase these orbs and you can find them, and they're pretty useful for that, and it will save you gold to upgrade from magic to rare directly. I would reserve this though for only maps that you know will be usable for your build, and if you find them magic initially, that is what I would do, and I wouldn't use that in any other scenario. Cartographer's Orb. Now this is where you can make maps. This is where you can actually reroll maps. So rerolling maps is pretty useful. So you're upgrading 3 of any maps of the same tier. So it could be tier 1, and then you're making 1 map that is a tier 2 out of that. So you're basically salvaging maps. You can't reroll 3 tier 3 maps into another tier 3 map or a dungeon. That doesn't work. So once it's a tier 3 map, it is not possible to reroll it. So keep that in mind. But the most common use of this, I would say, especially if you don't want to get trolled by a bug that's still in the game, where you can get a hatchet if you try to roll tier 1s into tier 2 maps. The most common use is to get really good tier 3 maps, like for group mapping or just for like optimal solo mapping, by converting 3 tier 2 maps that you don't need into a tier 3. And it might be a good tier 3 like cows or whatever. It's really, really good. Of course, I could demonstrate this as well without too much difficulty. I could use 1 Cartographer's Orb here. Let's see, what tier 2s do we not really use here? Oh yeah, these. Okay, so yeah, we could use some Ruins of Ijun maps to demonstrate this. So I put those in the queue with the Cartographer's Orb, and then boom. Now I lost 3 of these maps, quantity 4 instead of 7, and we got 1 Ashen Plains, which is a tier 3. Now we don't need the Ashen Plain map, so we got a bit unlucky, but that depends on your build. And, you know, obviously cow maps are the most valuable maps, so getting those Blood Moon rolls just by converting tier 2s into tier 3s can be quite handy and quite valuable. And in general, just getting tier 3s that are good for your build, or tier 3s that are better for experience just because of the monster types in the map. If you want to run group maps, you know, those really juicy group maps like Pandemonium Citadel, Kyrgyzstan Marketplace, and the such, or Sanatorium, for instance. Ones that just have really nice experience. Alright, well, at least those would be the maps in Season 9. And in future seasons, it might be a totally different suite of maps that fits that description, but you get the idea. Alright. And then lastly, we have Orbs of Fortification. Alright, so Fortification Orbs. Basically, this is a map with exactly what it says. You get double loot and double experience from the maps that are in there, but you have the map density, so you cut it in half. No matter what the stats are, whatever, you cut the total map density in half. And then the monsters do 20% more damage, and they have double experience. Or they have double HP as well. So the monsters get stronger. You cut the density in half, and then you get double loot and double experience. And this is a map that's really good for builds with low AoE. It's just really good for those types of builds in general. So for instance here, let's pull up my Season 9 Anarchy PD2 late game mapping tier list and infographic, which of course you can access through YouTube here as well, or through my Discord, or even through my Twitch chat as well. You can access this through a lot of means, but basically here I have an indicator of whether or not a build is either can do Fortify, or Fortify to be pretty solid for the build, shouldn't do Fortify because the build really thrives on monster density, and so lowering that density isn't good because making the monster stronger and lowering the density for whatever reason doesn't meld for the build. Maybe it just does low damage, but over a large area, so that's not good. Whereas maybe some builds are really good with Fortify, and they have double check marks here because they do damage maybe in a lower area, but they do a ton of damage in that area. And so they're better with lower density maps that are giving double loot. And you know, you got Zealers being pretty good for that, and you got most builds I would say can do fortified maps, but that's not necessarily required. And then of course the best fortified mapper in the game, in my opinion, would be this one, Dragon Tail, right here, where Dragon Tail hits so absurdly hard, it's one-shotting fortified monsters with the huge increase in their HP, and obviously the AoE impact from it isn't insane, but you can clear out those elite monster packs pretty much 1 or 2 shots, no problem with this build, and then move on to the next pack. So it is a density thing for sure. It is a density thing, and yeah, you can always refer to my late game mapping tier list in case you don't know whether or not your build should or can do a fortified map. But it's just another orb you can put in the cube with the map itself, and you can fortify it. And yeah, keep in mind you can fortify, corrupt, whatever the map in any order, and it will apply it without a problem. So don't worry about the order that you put these items in the cube with the map, you know, catalyst shard, whatever. Standard of heroes, in any order you can modify the map with these stats. Actually, I think standard of heroes yeah, no, never mind. You can do that. Yeah, any order works. I was just trying to think if there might be an exception to that. I'm like 99% sure that is the case. So, feel free to fortify the map first and then corrupt it or whatever. Actually, I think you might have to corrupt before you fortify. Now that I think about it, yeah, that's possible, but I don't think so. I think you can do these in any order. Anyway, the Orb of Fortifications are pretty cheap. They're actually the cheapest orb because it really is just a build thing, and they don't want to punish builds for wanting to run fortified maps. So, fortified maps are really cool, and they're really, really good for certain builds, and they will increase your loot yield and your experience yield on all kinds of low but powerful, low AoE but high damage density builds is what I call them, like high amount of damage in that smaller area. So that's really cool. And of course, my late game mapping tier list and infographic will show you just how good it is for every build, whether it's not good or whether it's amazing or whether it's decent. All right, so that's pretty much it. So the next thing is map immunities. Now we can also pull up the infographic again for this, and you will see here that these do change potentially every season. I think the last time there was a map rotation though, or a major change to these, that was season 6 or season 7. So maybe like every 2 to 3 seasons you can expect this, but that's not a hard and fast rule. They might even rotate them again next season, like who knows. I do keep this updated though, so you'll know which maps are tier 1, which maps are tier 2, which maps are tier 3. You can also find a similar infographic on the wiki as well, the Project Diablo 2 wiki as well, so they update that for the maps as well. As you can see though, the vast majority of maps are tier 3, especially if we include the unique maps, which have special properties. But yeah, at any rate, we'll talk about that in a bit though, but this will also show you how immune the monster is as well, which will tell you how hard it will be to break the immunity. Really high immunities might take a combination of things instead of, for instance, just like one thing to make them not immune. Like, for instance, this is an unbreakable cold immune, like 180, it doesn't matter. Whether or not you have conviction, lower resistance, and Arctic Blast on the monster, it still won't break. So yeah, it's just too high. But in most cases, a combination of some of those things will break the immunities, and it'll tell you how easy it is to break anything close to 100, which tends to be most lightning immunes or poison immunes or physical immunes. It's very breakable. And magic immunes are just tough to break because there's only one way to break them, which is the Sanctuary Aura. So yeah, as you can see here, gives you exactly which immunity types and then how hard it is to break those immunities. Now, this will just in general give you an idea of like whether or not you should run the map on your build. So this is very important. Now, loot filters have this built in too, including mines. So you'll see, for instance, there is a line there. It says immunities. It's very colorful, rainbow. And then it says light, poison, and physical. That means those are the immunities you will encounter in there. And sure enough, on here, it's light, poison, and physical as well on my chart. But you can plan out what kinds of maps you're going to be seeking and prioritizing though on your build after you see this chart. And then just to remind yourself, you can look at it in the game as well using your loot filter. Now, as you can see here, depending on your build, some might be very problematic. If you have a magic damage build, for instance, like hammers or teeth or whatever, you really want to like hard avoid magic immune maps because they're either like going to be super hard to kill even after you break it because there's not a lot of sources of negative magic res, or it's going to be impossible. So there's going to be monsters you can't kill. That's a real problem, for instance. Physical damage as well could be problematic as well, but most of those builds have amp or decrep or a combination of the two built into them, particularly amplify damage. And usually you could break these pretty easily, but there's also not a lot of other sources of negative res. So after you break it, the monster might still have a lot of physical res. So that might prove to be tough for your physical builds as well. However, when it comes to builds that have facets, such as fire, cold, lightning, and poison build, as long as you can break the immunity, in most cases, you might still be fine to run the map. However, as you can see, a lot of the resistances are very high. So it might still take a combination of things, which solo you might not have access to, or you might not have enough negative res elsewhere on your build to still make it worth it. In most cases, you will want to avoid maps, no matter what element of damage your build primarily does, or elements, you want to avoid maps that have those elements, period. Most of the time. So if you're a fire build, you don't want to do Ruins of Ijun. And if you're a lightning build, you also don't want to do Ruins of Ijun. But maybe if you're a lightning build, you want to do Bastion Keep. No lightning immunes here. Now there's some exceptions to this, of course. And this is something that, you know, it'll take a little bit more tinkering with your build and maps and trial and error. Because it kind of depends on the map and it kind of depends on your build. Like, for instance, Fledgathon does have lightning immunes, but they're only the shamans. That's not a very, like, dense monster in that map, you know? It's a monster you'll encounter here and there. It might reduce your yield to not be able to kill them instantly in the map, but the Merc can often kill it very quickly, or you can just ignore these monsters because they're not very dense. And a lot of lightning builds have access to multiple ways to break lightning immunes, such as static field, plus, you know, conviction, plus all the other stuff, which will allow you to at least kill them if you have a lot of negative res on top of that. So that's something to consider, that maybe on Fledgathon you would still want to run it on a lightning build. It's also possible here that you're going to want to run a lot of these things as well. I do realize also that my like webcam is kind of in the way of some of them, so you can't like view it directly, but obviously, you know, on the actual spreadsheet itself, you'll be able to view all of them. I'm just giving examples you guys can kind of see here. But yeah, anyway. Like on Lost Temple, like on an Inferno Sorc, for instance, I can break most fire immunities. Like, I can break a lot of fire immunities. And in a lot of cases, the monster is not fire immune enough to the point that it would deter me from running it. Anything like 120 and lower, for instance, is very breakable. So on Lost Temple, I can very easily run this and have no problems. So I can break the fire immune, and then because Inferno has so much negative res, and I have so much negative res everywhere else on my build, including Infinity, the fire immunes in this map will melt just as quickly, practically, as all the other monsters around it. Almost, like, literally 95% as quickly. And so for me, it doesn't matter that there's fire immunes in Lost Temple. It's still a good map for my Inferno Sorc. So there's, you know, that's a good example for my build, which is why I've made some Lost Temple maps here, and I've rolled them rare, and they're ready to go for when I run them. later. But yeah, that's how it goes. It depends, but in general, whatever your element is, you want to avoid those immunities that are either on the chart or shown by your loot filter when you pick up the map. Anything else is usually pretty good, but there's also other considerations as well, such as the dimensions of a map, like how the map is in general, like the geography of the map. So like some maps are very they're very like they have a lot of narrow passages, and it's mostly just narrow passages. Builds that do damage over the length of that passage or the width of that passage tend to be very strong in those, but maybe they don't do damage in a circular area quite as well. So if there's a lot of large open rooms in the map, maybe that same build wouldn't do as well because it's only doing damage forward and in a cone. So if you're like, for instance, a Twister Druid, maybe you don't want a wide open map because you'd prefer one with lots of narrow corridors, because you'll be able to clear all the monsters ahead of you in the narrow corridors. And in a larger room type map, or where a map that has a lot of these larger rooms, it's going to be tougher to clear all the monsters, and then the monsters can surround you, and then you can't deal damage to them all at the same time as well. Whereas there's some builds like Poison Nova or Corpse Explosion that just deal damage to a very wide AoE of monsters all around you potentially, and you could even target right on top of you and kill the monsters as well, which might favor a map with more open spaces. Wide open spaces. This also applies to builds that tend to be good at, for instance, clearing the cow level, where you want a build that has just a ton of AoE all around you for the most part in order to be effective in the Blood Moon Tier 3 map. So there's a lot of other things to consider as well besides just immunities. Inferno does damage in front of you, and you can sweep it to kind of like, you know, melt all the monsters directly in front of you. Notice that most of these maps don't have a ton of very wide open areas, maybe minus Ancestral Trial. Most of them are more narrow passage type maps for the most part. And however, this, of course, there's always some exceptions within the map itself, and it kind of depends on where in the map. So there's some areas that are going to be tougher than others. This is one of the reasons, of course, I don't think Ancestral Trial is quite as good for this map as, for instance, for this build, I mean, as River of Blood is. Because River of Blood is almost all narrow corridors leading up to the boss and then back. So this is definitely something to consider, of course, as well when you're trying to think of what maps are best for my build. People always ask me that all the time. Immunities is definitely the first consideration. However, in some cases, you can overcome the immunities and it's still fast to kill them, or ignore them depending on how dense that immunity is in that map. And then, of course, the next major consideration is the geography of the map, the size of the rooms, you know, whether or not the monsters can only come at you in a funnel, in a very narrow passage, or whether they can come at you from all sides in very large rooms or just wide open spaces, such as in Blood Moon or Ruins of Vijun, for instance, where it's basically one wide open space or a whole bunch of them. So keep that in mind. Those things definitely matter. And of course, the wider these spaces are, it kind of depends on how wide your projectiles are as well. And that's really what matters when you're trying to think of what are your best maps. But there's so many different scenarios I could go into there that we can't really go over them all in this video, despite this video being a pretty long, comprehensive map overview video for people that are really interested in understanding everything about maps. Alright, so as you can see, my tier list and infographic isn't only a late game mapping tier list, which won't only tell you how good your build is for late game mapping, especially tier 3s, which were tested for that mapping tier list, but it also tells you everything about whether or not Fortification is good, tells you whether or not mapping on hardcore is easy on that build as well, and of course will give you that chart there, which will update and show you a complete comprehensive list of the map immunities for that season as well, and make sure those are updated. All right, and now we're going to go over map stats. So, and how important the stats are, relatively speaking. So when it comes to loot and experience, which is what most people want, most of the time, the most important main stat on a map is monster density. This is why earlier on in the video I talked about density cutoffs, or rather where you kind of want the density in Season 9 because of the new density numbers. That stat, though, tends to always be the most important stat. Now, it depends on the build to some extent, but most builds are good with density, and the more density, the better. There's some builds maybe, though, where it's like Chain Lightning or Chain Lightning Sentry, where lower density isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's not too low, and where maybe you might want to focus on some other stats to get loot or experience, whether or not it's the experience stat on the map or the magic and gold find stat, whatever it is. But monster density is your key stat for the most part, because that's really what's going to determine how fast you're able to kill monsters, how many monsters per minute you're going to be able to kill with the build that you're running. No matter how strong it is, this is pretty much always the case. Obviously, once you go from white to rare maps, the density gets a lot higher. And obviously, once you go from tier 1 to tier 3 maps, the modifier or the number can get higher as well, which we talked about both of those things. So, density is good. This is why doing a tier 3 map fast, for instance, is very good as well. Tier 3 rare map is the pinnacle of density solo farming if your build can handle it. Alright. So that's like the really important stat. That's the one you want as high as possible. With the tier 3 rare maps, like I said, if you can get it 90 or even 100 plus on that stat before corrupting it, you're going to be in good shape. So before corruption or any other modifier like standard of heroes, that's kind of where you want it to be when you're rolling the map. So using the Haradrim Orbs, you reroll the maps with the perfect gems, the Haradrim Orbs, and the random rune in the cube with the map. You keep re-rolling it till you get good ones, and then bam, you end up with stats that you want. You want to try to go for density. Density is like the first stat you look for when you're re-rolling or rolling a map. Alright, I've repeated that enough times, that thing now. Very important. Very important stat. It is period the most important stat. It's going to matter more than even the experience stat, even if you're going for experience, because it will determine how many monsters you're just simply able to kill. It's very, very important. Now, the next important stat, I would say that's probably of secondary importance. It doesn't always roll, and it's not super common, but it's a lot more common than it used to be, which is the monster rarity stat. So usually maps of higher monster rarity have lower density. For instance, the density on this one's only 97. But if you do happen to roll monster rarity, as long as the density isn't super low, keep it. That is a great map, typically. Monster rarity means it increases the number of elite packs in the map, which, if you don't already know, minions and elite monsters have higher chances of way higher chances of dropping the GG loot than just the regular monsters with the no modified stats or anything, just the humdrum of the normal monsters in the map. They're a lot better. Of course, they're also giving you a lot more experience because they're a higher level. The champions are 2 levels higher than the map, and then of course the minions and the elites are 3 levels higher. That's going to give you more experience. No matter what level you are, the experience will also go up. So rarity is very important. Getting a lot more elite packs on that map is going to make a huge difference. So if you ever roll that stat, that is really, really good. Alright. And then next, kind of depending on your activity and what you're really focusing on, you have experience in magic and gold find. As you can see here, both of these on this current map were hovered over as which is my tier 3 Pandemonium Citadel. Alright. So experience, if you're doing group mapping, this is a pretty important stat. This is secondary to density, but in general, when you're trying to group map, you want both of those stats to be high if you can. You want the density to be like 100 plus, and you want the experience to maybe even be 20 plus if you can, but maybe at least 15 plus, right? And that will make you a pretty solid map when you roll a rare map before corrupting it or anything else, or standard of heroes. Corrupting obviously can increase the experience, and then so can standard of heroes, which automatically will increase those base stats, the experience and the density. So, and I think it also increases the gold find by like 10% as well, or the magic find, I should say. Of course, these are very good. So if you're going for experience, it's kind of what you're looking for in a rare tier 3 map. Now, if you're solo mapping, doing some kind of solo mapping journey, it's the same. Experience and density and rarity are going to be your best friends. And if you're trying to do a solo grind to 99, that will also be very important. And obviously, you're going to want to only do those in tier 3s, especially once hitting level 96. Once your character hits level 96, tier 2s and tier 1s are really no longer efficient anymore. And I'd say tier 2s are like, they could be okay up to like 97, but you really want to start doing tier 3s once you hit about that level, and that's typically what you would do here. But anyway, if you're doing magic finding though and mostly looking for loot, that's where the magic and gold find stat comes in. Now that stat might be even more important if you're not wearing geeds or something, because you really want that gold so you can continue to purchase orbs, unless you just want to trade for all your orbs, which is fine. You can definitely do that. But your map rerolling orbs, once again, are very gold expensive, so that stat does matter a bit for getting that gold. But the magic find stat, that is additional magic find that will add on to your base magic find. So this character has a base magic find of 272. If I do this map right here, it's going to add 24 magic find to that, making it 296. Alright, that's what that does. And of course it adds to whatever gold find you have as well. So that will also increase it that way. See, this map is 71 magic and gold find. So in that map, I almost have 350 MF. That's a lot. If you don't know, magic find, you know, once you hit about like 200 to 300, that's usually a pretty good sweet spot for most characters. In terms of balancing out your damage, making sure you're getting as much damage as possible, while also getting a decent amount of magic find to find things. Of course, beyond that is just luxuries. So if you already have 272 and your map's giving you like 130 MF like this map is, that's really good, because then you're hitting 400 MF, and that's really good for finding unique and set items. And remember, magic find helps you find unique, sets, rares, and blues over white items in that order. So any item that can't roll unique, set, rare, or blue isn't affected by magic find whatsoever. But that stat is very good for finding those nice things, and it will help to increase your war chest for slamming. So, you know, if you want items for your slam tank or slam fest, that magic and gold find be pretty important. And if you just want items to gamble in general with World Stone Shards, whether it's a slam fest or not, it's still going to be very important. So, very important stats there. These are all the main stats that are like the priorities on what you're looking for. If you're mainly looking for loot, it's going to be rarity, density, and then magic and gold find in that order. Because once again, magic and gold find doesn't affect every kind of item. So high runes, for instance, are just going to be affected by density. And this is definitely something to keep in mind. But then if you're doing experience, it's going to be rarity, density, and then experience in that order. And so those are going to be the main stats that you're going to be trying to go for. If you want to go for both, you can kind of balance it out. But in general, you know, at that point, density is really the only thing that matters for you, probably over everything. Once again, density and rarity are the most important stats. And then the experience and gold magic find kind of comes secondary. They might be more important, like maybe your magic find is really low on your character. Just getting 50 more MF might be huge, or 100 more MF. So maybe that stat becomes really important to you if you can't put a lot of MF on your character and you want to find stuff. You know, maybe the only thing you care about is just getting experience faster. Well, in that case, that stat might matter even more as well. So keep those other considerations in mind, but overall, what I told you is pretty much correct. All right, what about these other stats here? You know, these other things that are making the monsters stronger. When and how are these problems? You know, this is I'll go over here a few ways these could be problems, but I'm not going to go over like an exhaustive list. All right, so for the most part, how your build interacts with these negative monster stats depends on a lot of things, and whether or not you actually care about them depends on other things as well. So, for instance, let's say you're playing hardcore versus softcore. These stats matter a lot more on hardcore. Alright, because you can die here and there in softcore, and you'll be fine, and it's okay if the map has some very dangerous stats, including ones that you rolled from corrupting using a Worldstone shard, which can make the maps even more dangerous. But maybe on softcore you really don't, this doesn't really matter too much, because making the monsters do more damage or making them stronger in various ways isn't really going to affect how much loot you're able to get. And, you know, if you die once here and there because the map is really strong, it's not really going to hurt you. So mostly you're looking for those top stats then. The experience, rarity, monster density, and magic and gold find stats. You can pretty much ignore most of the rest of the stats if you're playing softcore most of the time. That being said, if you're going for 99 on the softcore, it's pretty much like playing hardcore, and then those stats will matter just as much pretty much as if you're playing hardcore. The other thing to note is even if you're not going for experience and you're okay hitting like a max level of 95 or 96, whatever, a stat that will always be something that might be something to avoid on softcore even is something like increased maximum life. So this is just going to make it less efficient to run the map in general. Now, obviously, with these negative stats, you will usually get better positive stats. So the worse the negative stat is that makes the monster stronger, typically, the better the bonus stats are. The map will typically have more density. It will have more gold find, it'll have more experience, usually more density to compensate for that really bad negative stat. Guest monsters almost always raise the profile of all of your positive stats. But it depends. Some of those monsters are just good on their own, and so some of those monsters don't really contribute too much to those positive stats, whereas things like witches or dolls or souls will make the monster density and the experience and all those other stats just go way up. Particularly the density, once again, which is the core stat of the map. Now, increased maximum life might increase those other stats, but what this means is that every monster on the map is going to have more life. And this stat can get really high, especially if you corrupt the map. It can get above 50%. And that means the maps have that means the monsters have 50% more life. They're going to be 50% harder to kill, and unless they're doing a lot more damage, it might be a slog to move through these maps, and it's just how it is. Especially if you're doing increased maximum life on top of a tier 3 map. You know, the monsters are level 89, they have more health than the tier 1 maps. That stat really starts to compound. Now, in a group mapping scenario where you have 8 players potentially, it might not matter too much that the monsters have a lot more health, because they already get the health bonuses from the player count anyway. But because you have 8 players dealing damage, the effects are kind of mitigated by that to some extent. That being said, though, it could even slow the whole group down. So, this is a stat where if you're playing a solo, usually you don't want this very high. I would even say not above 20%, almost practically ever if you're solo mapping, because it's really going to slow you down in most scenarios. Not every scenario, but in the vast majority of scenarios and with the vast majority of builds. Some builds are so strong that it might not feel this effect though, so maybe you don't care about it, but for the most part, you will. It's going to slow you down, you're not going to one-shot the monsters as much, it's going to suck. And ideally, you don't have this stat on the map at all. And when I test and I standardize test the builds for each season for the tier list, I make sure this stat is non-existent, because it has a very large variance, and it's not easy to control for, and it really makes builds a lot slower than they would be otherwise in most cases. Sometimes, though, that stat comes accompanied, though, with really high density and gold find, and maybe it has high rarity, so maybe it's worth it. But like I said, if you can keep it below like 20%, on most builds, and 0 if you really can. In most cases, you'll be good. For group mapping, it could be really high, and it might not matter if you have a good group. If you don't have a good group and you don't have a lot of sources of negative res, or you don't have good team synergy, you might want to consider removing that from group maps as well. Another thing to note is there is a corruption which can make the maximum life of monsters way higher as well, which is maybe the closest thing you can get to bricking a map in some cases. So like, you can't brick a map anymore with the shards. This used to be a thing in previous seasons. There's no longer bricking. You just get stats on them. But in terms of like making the map unrunnable or very bad, yeah, it's not good. So that's something that's almost universally not a great thing. In recent seasons, they've definitely made the rewards way higher for increased maximum life, so that's good. But in general, it's still very hard to deal with. And it will drastically reduce your efficiency no matter how the other stats are, depending on if your build really counts on those one-shots or not, because it can really change the speed. Like, it could double the speed very quickly, how long it takes to clear a map. So that's something to keep in mind. Softcore, hardcore, doesn't matter. That stat can be a problem. Now, if you're playing hardcore going to 99, you're going to care about maybe the rest of these stats, or if you're just trying to get experience in general. Because these stats can get you killed. And that's how simple it is. That's really what the other stats on these really matter. Some of the guest monsters like souls are very dangerous almost to most builds unless you have lightning sorb or max lightning res as well. And so those could prove to be problems for almost any map, especially a whole group of people that probably doesn't have the requisite lightning res, and then is going to prevent you from progressing quickly on the map in general and will constantly get you killed, which might even affect your ability to get loot. So most of these maps, most of these stats don't matter too much, I'll be honest. Like, life stolen per hit is not really a stat that does too much for the monster. However, some of these stats can matter quite a bit. Maybe it reduces your faster hit recovery, so then when you get hit or you take more than the 12th of your health and damage, which is what hit recovery is, you're going to take a while to recover. That could get you killed if you have low hit recovery, or if it even passes into the negative values, 0 or below, could be pretty nasty. That is something to take into consideration if you're not a max block build, for instance. Let's say you're a summoner. Monster melee attacks deal splash damage. Well, this stat is a problem if you're a summoner of any kind, because that means every time a monster hits one of your summons, whether it's a skeleton or a wolf or whatever it is, it will be hitting almost all your summons. So that's going to get your summons killed, and this could be a problem even for progressing through a map at all on a summoner. Not even talking about hardcore or going to 99. So some of these other stats are very situational. You also have sorbs. Those can become a problem. I would say the less negative enemy resistance you have on your gear, and the less instantaneous your damage is, and the more over time your damage is, the more those absorbs can really make that map take so much longer or even unrunnable for your build. For instance, on my build, Inferno, I really want to avoid Fire Absorb, because it's a continuous damage, and the monsters can reduce that damage with the Absorb every frame it is active. It is ticking on the monster. That is not good. Of course, on magic builds like hammers and teeth don't have a lot of access to ways to reduce magic resistance, so the monster base magic resistance plus their sorb is going to make it take a lot longer to clear the map. So magic absorb becomes a lot more impactful against those builds as well. So those absorb stats can just be really, really nasty. There's other stats as well that can make the monsters do more damage, such as poison skill damage. So let's say the monsters already do poison damage in the map you're running. That will increase their damage. Now, will even increase the damage of the boss if it does. Like, for instance, let's say this is a sewers map. It's not. But that boss does a lot of lightning damage. and let's say it has lightning skill damage, that will make the boss's hit even harder. So that is something to note. The boss typically does a lot of damage, and if it's an increase to its element of damage, that will even increase the boss's damage. Now, things like monster faster hit recovery or life leech or even replenish aren't too impactful. If monsters take reduced physical damage, though, that could be a problem for a build that does, like, bleed, for instance, because bleed is a physical damage. And once again, it's constantly ticking, so that's going to reduce that damage for every tick of bleed. That could be a problem. If monster has increased defense, so like this one, enhanced defense, or sorry, no, this reduces your own defense, which that doesn't usually matter much unless you're relying on a ton of your own defense. But where's the monster has increased defense one? I don't know if we have this one, but oh yeah, right here. What that does is that can actually make monsters more likely to be stone skin as well if they're elites, which if you're a physical damage character, you might really want to avoid that. If you get burning souls in your map, which is a guest monsters are usually good. They don't have immunities anymore innate, which is nice, so you can pretty much kill them with any character, but they can maybe still kill you. Witches always cast amp on you and attack from afar with a lot of damage. So if you get succubus witches, that can definitely increase your risk of death, no problem. Burning souls, unless your lightning res or sorb is above 75 and stacked, a conviction soul can very easily get you killed. Unless your build can quickly pass through enemies or just kill them from afar, you might not want to run Stygian dolls. They'll blow you up and kill you, or they'll kill your summons or your mercenary. These are definitely things to consider, so a map like this might be problematic, but since I'm an Inferno and I attack monsters from afar, this one doesn't really affect me all that much. Enhanced physical damage. If there's a lot of high physical damage monsters in a map and they get some auras and they have even more physical damage added to this because of the map, that can be dangerous. Crushing Blow will chunk your life for fixed amounts of damage and can be very, very dangerous. There's definitely a lot of maps with that, and of course even range enemies can apply it, so I'd say it's pretty dangerous in monsters and maps with archers and things of that nature. And so Crushing Blow can be very dangerous, but particularly if your health is low, because the Crushing Blow damage will never go to your mana, even if you have Energy Shield. It will always go to your life. So on my build, if I'm doing a map with archers or dart blowers or quill rats, I really don't want to do one with Crushing Blow because my health pool is not very high on this particular build. Even after bow, I mean, you can see if the Crushing Blow damage always goes to my life and there's a high Crushing Blow percent on the map, that's a problem. What if your build relies heavily on block? Or what if you don't want to block? You know, maybe this is a stat that matters. If you have a build that relies on block for a lot of its defensive potential and you have a negative block map that reduces your own block, that could be that's definitely dangerous, especially on a map with a lot of ranged physical damage enemies, once again like archers and quill rats. That is dangerous. Let's say some of your resistances are pretty low. Now, normally in maps, you kind of want to have as high resistances as possible. I recommend like 50 plus minimum, even on softcore. Otherwise, you're going to be dying a lot. You'll be draining a lot of HP. And in hardcore, you really want to have max res on everything if possible. You really want to make sure those are good. So like on my hardcore Sork here, I make sure those resistances are high. High. But notice on this one Crushing Blow map I'm going to do, you know, there's no range monsters, so that's something to kind of... things can't hit me very often, so I don't really care about the Crushing Blow quite as much. So yeah, but let's go back to resistances though. Let's say your resistances are low. This is definitely something that becomes kind of important. So the skill damage might be something you might be worried about, like adding to whatever the monster's attacks are. If it's adding to their damage type somehow, and your resistance is low, that could be a problem. But another thing that could be a problem is, let's say you have monster damage conversion. So monsters have 76% of physical damage as extra fire damage. There's a lot of ranged physical enemies, or just physical enemies in general, in that map. They're going to all be doing extra fire damage on top of their physical damage. And that means that if your fire res is trash, they might all of a sudden, where they weren't able to kill you before, now you're dying very fast in that map. For instance, this map has monsters get 3 elements of extra damage. This could be problematic, you know. And the other thing is, if you get monsters doing elemental damage constantly as well, and your energy shield, that's not good, because energy shield is not very strong against elemental damage. It's stronger against physical damage. And also, obviously, poison damage will go straight to your health as well, so that's another consideration. Maybe you don't want to run this because it gives extra poison damage. There's poison damage everywhere in this map. And if you get dart blowers in there, you know, that's going to hurt. It's going to do a lot of extra damage. And if your resistances on your poison, cold, and fire damage, fire resistances are all low, those monsters are going to shred you, because now they're doing more of all 3 of those types of damage. So that's definitely something to think about. Monsters can also get increased cast speed and velocity, which in general will make monsters more dangerous, like things like chargers or lancers, or monsters from afar that cast and attack like archers. Those things will then fire at you faster, and you need to be willing to recover your health faster. Of course, sometimes other stats like map contains an additional boss could be good, but if that boss is dangerous for your build for whatever reason, because maybe you have low res, or your build doesn't protect well against elemental damage, whatever it is, maybe that could get you killed. But obviously killing 2 bosses worth of loot is typically a pretty good thing, right? So a stat like that could be pretty good as well. Getting additional crafting materials or charms or armor can help out with loot, but those aren't usually primary considerations, but some of those stats are also very good on maps. So as you can see, there's like a lot of things to think about. Definitely. Some of these things are definitely more impactful than others. I definitely think monster curse duration reduction is typically not super impactful. If you're a character that needs meat shields to attack things and to take damage in front of you, maybe monsters having chance to pierce is a problem, and it can get you killed as well. If you don't have any replenished life, or you just don't have a lot of life in general, your life draining quickly every second, and you don't have a way to replenish it with like life per kill or life replenish or any kind of stat like that, even that can become a bit of an annoyance, or you might have to constantly run health potions. So these are all many of these considerations. I think at this point I've pretty much gone over most stats to some degree to give you guys an idea what all these map stats do, so that you guys are at least aware of maybe what to avoid or what to focus on, or what really isn't a big deal for your build. Most of them aren't a huge deal, but once again, it kind of depends on your build. What's interesting is, since you don't really have magic resistance on your gear, physical magic damage conversion will go right through your damage reduction, for instance, and that will do additional damage. So yeah, there's just a lot of things to really think about. Things that can get you killed, and things you really want to worry. Alright, and finally we're coming up upon the final segments of this video here, which are corrupting maps and unique maps. We'll go over unique maps last, which is like one of these. They all have like special attributes, and they're tougher than average tier 3 maps, and they give you they have special loot odds, and they have special loot of various types in various cases, which are kind of neat, and they can be a very good path to get rich very fast. But yeah, let's talk about corrupting though. So corrupting, basically, you know, this is one of the things you can apply to maps. I mentioned all the other things you can do. You can fortify a map, you can catalyst shard a map, you can use a standard of heroes from Uber Ancients on a map in Season 9, and you can corrupt them, and I believe you can do those in any order. Once again, I don't think I found a case where you can't do that, but I might be wrong. Maybe Fortifying has some special things to it. I don't remember. But in general, I've never really run into that problem very often. But you can expend shards, and you should expend shards whenever you have shards available. So the good thing about having corruption zones in Project Diablo 2 since last season, Season 8, and now Season 9, is that you can generate Worldstone shards very fast if you're running out, even if people don't want to trade them. There's so many different uses for shards, like corrupting all kinds of items for potentially GG slams, which are really what it's going to sell in the late game especially, or in the late season. But corrupting maps makes them typically way better. And if you can corrupt maps, you should corrupt maps. It's that simple. Don't worry about it. If you have shards and you think you can get shards easily, especially if you're a Sorc, which sorceresses or just any kind of teleporting character tends to have an advantage in farming those LOD zones for loot, and of course those corruption zones for shards. Shards are really good. Always use the shards on the map. Always corrupt the maps. Now you'll note that in a lot of cases, they'll boost the experience. It boosts the density. Those red dots are all boosts. And you'll notice that the density was greatly boosted. And that's a cow map. Very important to get high density on these cow maps, right? Greatly boosted by the corruption, which is really key. And the magic find's already high, so that might be a pretty juicy map. And we'll have to see, of course, but you see what happens. You know, obviously there's RNG and all kinds of things. Doesn't matter how high your magic and gold find gets, you know, there's diminishing returns on it, and then there's RNG. So who knows what happens. But look at it, though. Look at it. That is strong. Now, there's usually a drawback to getting these huge stat increases, such as like this one. Monsters have 17% Deadly Strike. And I think with the Deadly Strike maps, you also get negative physical resistance as well, which for some reason doesn't show on the map until you create it. I don't know what it is, but some of these corruptions, one of these corruptions, I don't remember which one it was, will also give reduce your own damage reduction, so it can make you a lot more vulnerable to physical damage attacks, which can definitely get you killed. Deadly Strike means the monsters can get 50% more damage 17% of the time when they hit you, so this can be dangerous. If you're playing hardcore, going to 99, something like this, if you get a really high density map or rarity map with really high stats that are very dangerous for your build, you might want to avoid them. It might get you killed. It's definitely possible. And when you're entering a group map, you might also want to take that into consideration as well. Most people just blindly enter the portal and see what happens. But and some people will blindly create the maps for an entire group, not caring whether they live or die. However, very important stuff. And obviously with player count, the monsters gain damage as well. So these stats will start to stack in effectiveness, going up from players 1. Very important. Of course, I can show you guys some other corruptions though. And oh, so we got the one I was talking about earlier. So that's kind of garbagey, but it's a map with monster rarity and it has huge density and experience. So I might run it anyway, but this map might be a little bit of a slog. The monsters almost have 50% more life, so 39%, that's a lot. And so it's going to take me quite a bit longer, I think, to complete this map than ordinarily. But since the stats are so high, and it even has monster rarity, which is that golden boy stat I was talking about earlier, which I'd say you can roll only once every like 5 to 10 rolls. So it takes a lot of rolls to get monster rarity. I think it's like 10% chance or something, but yeah, it's really good. But you'll notice that it increases all of your stats significantly, even things as bad as increased maximum life, and then cannot be frozen, which means if you have cold damage, you need to kind of depend on that for slowing down the monsters. Yeah, unless you have Holy Freeze, you know, that could be a problem, right? So they also get that stat there. Let's see what we get on this one. Rarity. So you can even get rarity through corruptions, which is something I haven't mentioned because obviously we just got to corrupting maps. And yeah, that's once again that's the biggest stat. Even beyond density, rarity is huge because those elite packs are huge for loot and experience. And then obviously it increased rarity and magic and gold find. So Pretty nice rolls there, pretty nice increases. But yeah, you can corrupt any map though, which is pretty neat, and so you can add all kinds of stats to it. We have density and rarity on this 2 Exultant Cool. So we got rarity and density this time, which is really good for almost any purpose. But now you're going to have negative maximum resistances, so that means that my max res will go down. Even though I have max res, it's going to go down to like 71. So that's going to increase the damage I take from those types of monsters. Universally, that are doing those types of doing elemental damage. So that is something to note. And if the map already has a lot of elemental damage built into it, such as physical to elemental damage conversion, I don't know, it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous, especially if there's a lot of that kind of conversion damage, or maybe you're over relying on energy shield, which tends to be pretty poor against elemental damage. Your mana does not hold up against those. Does not hold up very well against all that elemental damage. But yeah, let's see if we can get some other ones so you can kind of see. Yeah, so we got Monster Rarity, Gold Find, and Magic Find here. Pretty similar to the other one. But in this case, it didn't add a negative stat, or at least I don't think it did. It might be the negative physical DR one. I don't remember which one it is because it doesn't show on the map itself, which I think is a bug. It will show though when you create the map and hover over the portal. So one of them does reduce your damage reduction, which is definitely dangerous for various reasons. Oh, we got the maximum life CBF one again. But this time the maximum life only went up by 15%. It's not a big deal, especially with really high density and experience. It tends to be really good. But in general, you pretty much cannot go wrong sharding a map. You really want to shard the maps as much as possible. So, you know, I'm just going to shard them all because I can. Negative res. See if you can see some other interesting corruptions. This one's got low deadly strike on it. Notice, though, that the corruptions become also the higher stakes, the higher tier the map is as well. So this is why doing tier 3 maps, if you can, are generally better than tier 1s. The stakes get higher, but also the monster or the player debuffs get higher as well. This one just increases your rarity and density, maybe not as much as some of the ones that have a pro and a con to them. This one is the big density one, so I just got a huge density boost on that map, and that's all I got. And since that's like the most important Cole stat, that's really good. The red dot will show the way. Rarity and Magic Find. So yeah, really good stuff. Oh yeah, almost 200 density. So this is almost the equivalent of a 420% density map before the changes this season, by the way. So this is like insane. This is gonna be crazy density on this. Really big. And then this one's the mega rarity corruption, with I don't think any drawbacks on that. So you just get 60% monster rarity, which is huge. Now that could make it more dangerous too, because all the elites have auras and things like that. So, you know, even some of these positive stats that are just positives, they make the map harder in some cases, so you might want to consider that. Higher density obviously does that by itself in most cases as well. Alright, and lastly, let's go over unique maps. Unique maps are here. So this is an example of one. There are 3 of them currently. There will probably be more in the future, but there's Warlord of Blood, Fallen Gardens, and Zara the Mad. This one is a map that where its gimmick is that every item that drops in the map is corrupted. So every item that's possible to corrupt is corrupted already. It's just corrupted. So you can find a 3-socketed Nightwings off the ground in this map. That's possible, as an example. The boss will also always drop a corrupted unique. So no matter what, you'll get at least some kind of corrupted unique. I think for that boss, the reward should maybe be like a high tier corrupted unique. Because he's just that dangerous, and these maps aren't very common, so these are like much rarer. So every other map, the rarity is equivalent to its tier. So the higher the tier, the more rare it is, but the higher tier of map you're doing, the more likely you are to find higher tier maps. No map is more rare than the next. But when it comes to unique maps, they have significantly higher rarity, so they're pretty hard to find. Fallen Gardens, though, which is a map that I currently don't have on hand to show, because I run the Fallen Gardens maps, and I also run the Czar the Mad maps. But Fallen Gardens, their gimmick is that the boss always drops a rainbow facet, and then the monsters are way more likely to drop jewels. And so then if you have high magic find, that also means rare and unique jewels as well. And then of course Czar the Mad always drops a skiller, so a skill, a grand charm with a skill on it. No matter what, the boss will drop one. And then it's also way more likely to drop charms of every kind, small, large, and grand throughout the map. Way more likely. So the charms drop crazy in that map, even compared to the jewels in the Fallen Gardens map. So it's kind of nuts. Getting those life skillers and getting like charms like this one, for instance, become very, very likely from that map, which is really cool. Just all kinds of like really good charms in general, just whatever charms. I'd pick them all up. Even the large charms can get like 4% skill damage, high life charms, whatever. But the other thing to note about all these maps, though, is that they generally are tougher than regular maps. They tend to have really high debuff stats compared to normal tier 3 or tier 2 maps. I think Fallen Gardens is tier 2 and the other two are tier 3. As of now, that's what it appears to be anyway. But when it comes to these maps, they always have like a really bad debuff stat, so they'll have like negative block no matter what, crushing blow no matter what, like in Warlord of Blood, and then increased maximum life is a stat. I think that's on every unique map, so the monsters no matter what have more HP, even from a base tier 3 map, no matter what. And then they have like really bad stats that can kill you no matter what, such as chance of crushing blow, negative block. Czar the Mad is negative all resistances, and I think the Fallen Gardens has deadly strike and negative physical resistance or something like that. So yeah, very, very potentially dangerous stats you have to deal with, and obviously they have like these very guaranteed stats that are also just very dangerous, like increased elemental damage of various kinds depending on the map. And it's very predictable what these maps roll. They roll pretty much the same kinds of stats, but they're tough and they can get you killed, and the monsters in them also tend to be a bit more dangerous than most other maps as well. Now, they're not as dangerous as a dungeon, of course. Nothing can be more dangerous than those monsters, and those monsters require a well-oiled machine of a group that reduces res and blocks damage with summons and does a lot of damage in general. But these maps you can do solo perfectly fine, and most people do these maps solo. But these maps also tend to have really good experience modifiers. The only thing is that you cannot corrupt them. Corruption doesn't do anything to them whatsoever. So they can make the map better than it already is. But notice that the experience value is very high. It wouldn't be bad to run these in a group. However, they always come with increased maximum life, and they always come with dangerous other stats. So that player count's going to magnify how dangerous those are. And so in a lot of cases, or most cases, I wouldn't say it's usually efficient to farm these types of maps in a group. They also tend to be very long, and they're much bigger maps as well, because once again, they're rare maps. They're just hard to find, and you can only find them. You can't roll them. You can't roll them with the Cartographer Orb. You can't roll up to them. It's impossible. And so you have to find them somewhere. And they're very big, and they're very unwieldy and just general giant maps. So typically for group farming scenarios, it's not super common to see these, but they're not terrible, though, for group farming. So, well, there you have it. You have unique maps with special gimmicks that are really tough. And now you know everything there pretty much is to know about maps as of Season 9. Things can change, but I think over the course of seasons, changes to maps have become fewer and far between as they have made adjustments to them throughout. Like, for instance, it used to be like you might not get every type of monster possible in each map, but now you can, which has prevented certain bugs, but it's also made it to where you'll encounter every type of monster that the map can spawn in every map. So, unlike LOD areas, which spawn 3 types of monsters, you're going to get these maps that have 6 types of monsters, and you're going to have to deal with them throughout every map, which is just going to be a little bit tougher. But overall, maps have become juicier for loot. They become more consistent as the seasons have gone on. And they're always really, really good to do once your build is capable of running them, at least to some decent degree. If you're slogging through a map, though, but you're able to blaze through high-level LOD content, you are definitely better off farming the LOD content until you're strong enough to start pushing those map times lower and lower. But anyway, you'll kind of feel it. You get a feel for it. You'll feel whether or not it's a slog and probably not worth it, just based on anything. And of course, you can always use the .kills/all function, which is a new function now in the game. If you're ever curious how efficient your farming is, just take a .kills all before you start a farm, and then in an hour, take another one, see how many monsters you killed, whatever. And then do the same for maps if you did that for LOD, and then see, how many monsters you're able to kill. And that's a pretty rough estimate of how efficient the farm will be. Of course, it discounts things like boss monsters or council members, which are just juicier in general as a single monster, but it does give you at least some idea of how fast you're able to kill the monsters. You want to be killing monsters faster and not slower overall. But yeah, very important stuff, of course. Hopefully you learned a lot throughout this video. It is a massive video we made here. I definitely don't know if I expected it to be almost 2 hours long, but we talk about a lot of stuff, and we go over a lot of stuff, and we'll definitely try to make sure you've got your timestamps ready to go, of course, for you guys, so that you guys will be able to master the art of mapping in any scenario. And that is what this video will provide you with. Anyway, we'll get the timestamps. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Did I pretty much cover everything to a high degree of accuracy that you'd like to see covered in this video? As much as possible. Is there any other topics regarding mapping that you feel like maybe I missed, or something that you would like to see maybe another video on in the future? And yeah, hopefully this video is a bit more future-proof than the one in Season 6. It's kind of a redo of that video, so awesome stuff. Anyway, see you guys later. And until the next installment of a Dark Humility video, which there's always plenty of Dark Humility over and out, see you guys later. The most awesome community on the internet, the Project Diablo 2. Softcore and hardcore, you guys are beasts. Let's get it.